when they talk.
Greetings and salutations. With the RPMs of today's never-ending war on terror revving up once again, and President Obama's decision to send even more U.S. Special Forces into Iraq to fight ISIS, it is important to remember and learn from the history of the U.S. involvement in overseas regional conflicts and civil wars. One of the most devastating examples of that was the Vietnam War. U.S. involvement in Vietnam's civil war between the North and the South began during the 1950s, leading to full-scale active combat units by 1965, all in the name of stopping the spread of communism, or at least that's what was sold to the American people and the rest of the world. The war, whose total death toll is estimated to be anywhere from 1 to 3 million lives lost, including the loss of 58,000 U.S. soldiers, I believe represents the worst in U.S. empire politics, which is why we must learn from its mistakes to keep them from repeating tomorrow and start watching the Hawks.
If you want to know what's going on in your city and your streets, never back down like Tyrell, and the truth is what you seek. To analyze, investigate from the bottom to the top. You speak your mind like Stone, whether they like it or not. I got Tabitha, Miss Wallace, with the wisdom and the pearl. Between the outrage and the evidence, what's going on in this world.
Watching the Hawks, watching the Hawks, watching the Hawks. Listen when they talk.
Welcome one and all to Watching the Hawks. I am Tyrell Ventura.
And I am Tabitha Wallace. U.S. foreign policy in the post-9/11 era is, well, a shambles. It seems that we lack a coherent vision of a peaceful and cooperative world. Why is this the case? Well, probably because our current government is unable to learn from the mistakes of history. Previously, we talked with Marjorie Cohn, law professor at the Thomas Jefferson School of Law, to discuss the Vietnam War and why we, as a nation, have been unable to take the lessons learned in that conflict and apply them to problem solving in the modern world.
Well, on the 50th anniversary of the Vietnam War, the Pentagon launched a website to kind of rewrite the history of the Vietnam War. It's kind of a revisionist history. It's honoring service members, U.S. service members who fought in the war, but there's scant mention of the anti-war movement, the heart of which was the GI movement. Millions of people were in the streets. Thousands of people were arrested, people were killed at Kent State and Jackson State, and that anti-war movement went pretty far in helping to end the war. The GI movement was a movement of thousands of service members who would get together in coffee houses and publish underground newspapers to talk about the war and their opposition to the war. And it was actually the opposition, the refusal of many of the ground troops to fight, that caused the United States to go to an air war in Vietnam. So the GI movement was a really critical part of the anti-war movement. And that is given very, very short shrift on this website, this $30 million website that the Pentagon has launched. Also, it really kind of sugarcoats some of the things that happened, including the My Lai massacre, which it calls the My Lai incident. It's routinely called the My Lai massacre, where U.S. soldiers went into the tiny village of My Lai in Vietnam and killed 300 to 500 old men, women, and children, just massacred them. And actually, someone was tried for that massacre, Lieutenant William Calley. Also, it gives short shrift, the Pentagon website gives short shrift to what the United States did to the people of Vietnam that still persists today, which is the spraying of Agent Orange as a defoliant to defoliate the areas, particularly around U.S. military bases. And Agent Orange contained the chemical dioxin, one of the most deadly chemicals known to man. The U.S. government and the chemical companies that manufactured dioxin, including notably Dow and Monsanto, knew about the horrible effects of dioxin. And in fact, there was a study called the Bionetics study from 1965, which was suppressed by the government and by the chemical companies. And when that report finally came to light, I think it was in 1971, the spraying of Agent Orange stopped. But unfortunately, these horrific effects of Agent Orange persist today. And we're talking about cancers and other diseases, horrific birth defects, I have seen children that just lie there, curled up limbs. Children are born without brains. They are born without limbs. And this is not just Vietnamese children and Vietnamese people suffering these diseases. It's also U.S. service members and Vietnamese Americans, the descendants of the people who came in direct contact with Agent Orange. And yet this Pentagon...
No, sorry, go ahead, go ahead.
No, the Pentagon website gives short shrift. They call it Operation Ranch Hand, and don't say much more about it. Now, I just do want to say one other thing, and that is that Veterans for Peace has launched a counter website called fulldisclosure.org, which has a number of articles about what really did happen in Vietnam, including the most recent article I wrote about the atomic bomb in Japan, and also the Agent Orange in Vietnam and in Japan as well.
Interesting. Well, now, when you talk about Agent Orange, the U.S. government has somewhat compensated U.S. veterans affected by Agent Orange while in Vietnam, but it's done little to help the Vietnamese government. In 1973, President Nixon agreed to pay $3 billion to Vietnam for post-war reconstruction, and none of that money has been delivered to date. Isn't that correct?
That is correct, and there has been some compensation as the result of a lawsuit which people that I work with brought against the chemical companies, but it's not nearly enough compensation for the U.S. vets. And the judge made sure that it promised the chemical companies that their liability was over. So when the Vietnamese victims, the intended victims of Agent Orange, brought a lawsuit, the judge knocked it out of court. So there has been some compensation for U.S. vets, but not nearly enough. And that's why the group that I work with, the Vietnam Agent Orange Relief and Responsibility Campaign, has helped to introduce a bill in the legislature, H.R. 2114. Congresswoman Barbara Lee has introduced it, which would help to compensate the victims both in Vietnam and in the United States, including Vietnamese Americans.
You know, it's interesting. The U.S. has apparently only helped clean up about one of the 28 Agent Orange hotspots in Vietnam. Why do you believe the U.S. hasn't done more? And what is it going? You mentioned the bill, but what is it going to take to get the U.S. government involved in fixing the damage that it has caused from using Agent Orange?
Yes, I just want to mention that the hotspots are the areas that still contain dioxin and still pollute the area and the groundwater. And the United States is cleaning up the Da Nang hotspot, but you're right, not the others. It will take political will. It will take pressure. Clearly, lobbyists have a lot to do with where money is allocated, and Congress is not terribly functional these days, but
very true
I guess
statement.
That's an understatement,
yes.
Right? But we're hoping to get more and more co-sponsors of H.R. 2114, so it's really important that people contact their representatives to co-sponsor H.R. 2114 to compensate the Vietnamese and the U.S. victims of Agent Orange, including U.S. service members, and clean up the remaining hotspots that still poison the country of Vietnam.
Can you tell us any more, talking about H.R. 2114, so it's going to deal directly with the effects of Agent Orange. Can you, how exactly will it be helping? What are the guidelines in this, and what's the major goal, and how is that going to be set about? How are we going to help, and how do we fix this?
H.R. 2114 will provide public assistance to public health organizations in Vietnam to reach some 3 million victims of Agent Orange, and that is doesn't just include people who were directly exposed to Agent Orange, but also their children and grandchildren. It will also provide assistance to male U.S. veterans of the Vietnam War to be consistent with the assistance provided to U.S. female veterans of the Vietnam War and their children. It will pay for research on Agent Orange in the Vietnamese American community, and also pay for the cleanup of dioxin in these hotspots that still poison the land and the water of Vietnam.
I think that's probably one of the scariest things in looking into this issue was how it isn't just people who were in direct contact with it, it's generations. And that's both here and in Vietnam. It isn't just people who are living there. Can you explain a little bit about just how that Agent Orange has affected generations, say 2 and 3 removed now from Vietnam?
Yes, women who were exposed to Agent Orange during the Vietnam War have children and grandchildren born with serious defects, and many of these people, the children who survive, are in friendship villages. They call them friendship villages. I think there are only 11 of them throughout Vietnam, and they need many, many more. Let me just say that I was a judge. I was one of 7 judges from 3 continents to sit on a tribunal in 2009 in Paris about Vietnam's Agent Orange, and we took 2 days of testimony from 27 witnesses, and many of whom had been there or were journalists, U.S. service members, scientists. And there was testimony, for example, by a man named Mai Jiang Vu, who carried chemicals on his back. He was in the South Vietnamese army, and some of those chemicals were Agent Orange. And his children were born with severe defects, their limbs curled up, they died very young. Another witness was Nhu Tran, who was a French Vietnamese woman journalist, and she had 2 daughters, and one of the daughters, her skin would shed, she would not allow any physical contact, she hated physical contact. She was born 6 pounds 6 ounces and died at the age of 17 months. At the 6 pound 6 ounce weight. And then we had scientists who testified, Dr. Gene Stellman, who said that Agent Orange in Vietnam is the largest unstudied natural disaster in the world. Another expert was Dr. Gene Grassman, who called dioxin a potent cell dysregulator. And there were many other people who testified. For example, George Mizo's widow. George Mizo was a U.S. service member who slept on the ground, was exposed to Agent Orange, and he started the first friendship village before he died of Agent Orange-related illnesses. But there are still, in these friendship villages, new babies born with these severe defects because of the exposure of their parents, grandparents, and eventually great-grandparents to dioxin during the Vietnam War.
As we go to break, Hawk Watchers, don't forget to let us know what you think of the topics we've covered on our Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube pages, and check out our full shows at RT.com. Coming up, we'll continue with the second half of this fascinating interview with Marjorie Cohn, where she will tell us just how close we came to using nuclear weapons in the Vietnam War. Stay tuned to Watching the Hawks.
I believe that the very best stock is made from quality ingredients. That's why I use North stock pots, slowly simmered to perfection. They help give a rich and meaty taste that makes my best spaghetti bolognese. Simply stir in and really taste the difference. Some say you can't buy taste, but I disagree. North stock pots, try it for yourself.
When it comes to your dry skin or eczema, trust E45. E45 cream is the #1 best-selling dry skin treatment. Its clinically proven formula creates an effective barrier that helps repair and protect even eczema-prone skin. E45, dry skin experts for more than 60 years. And for your very dry hands, trust E45 Intense Recovery. It immediately softens your hands. E45 hand creams, preferred by more than 80% of consumers.
Blouse or bib? Jeans or dummy? Depends on whom you ask. That's why you need to add Dettol antibacterial laundry cleanser. Dettol's special formula is proven to kill 99.9% of bacteria, so you can help keep your family healthy. Dettol antibacterial laundry cleanser.
Standard aerosols may contain added water, which could eventually fall down and spoil the experience. Introducing Airwick Pure with no added water, so you can experience a great fragrance with no wet spray. Airwick Pure, just fragrance, no wet spray.
Yes! 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 Oh, yes!
Ah,
the sound of being accepted for a Luma credit card. At Luma, we've now said yes to 200,000 people. So if you've got poor credit, you could be accepted too. With credit limits up to £1,500 and no annual fee, at Luma, we say yes to someone every 6 minutes. So for a response in 60 seconds, go to luma.co.uk today. Luma, what would yes mean to you?
Yes!
As Americans, we tend to focus on the suffering of our young men and women sent off to fight in wars which they have no interest in. But what about the victims of our aggression? What are the attitudes of those in countries where the American military has been nothing but a nuisance at best or a total force of destruction at worst? Recently, Marjorie Cohn gave us an exclusive look into the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese people so many years after the devastation of their country.
3 million people were killed in the Vietnam War in Vietnam. And we talk about the 58,000 deaths of U.S. service members, which is a tragedy as well. And in fact, more service members have committed suicide since the Vietnam War from post-traumatic stress disorder than died in the war, which is a statistic that is astounding and many people don't understand. But the country of Vietnam continues to suffer the effects of this horrible war. And during the war, and I remember this because I was very active in the anti-Vietnam War movement, the Vietnamese would say, the American people are not our enemy. It's the American government, and they made a distinction. So after I was a judge on this tribunal in 2009 in Paris, I was president of the National Lawyers Guild, and we went to Vietnam to present our findings to the government of Vietnam. And I remember sitting at a table with the president of Vietnam and other people, and we were allowed to ask a couple of questions. And I asked the president of Vietnam why the Vietnamese people did not hate Americans, and that I was always so surprised that the Vietnamese people would make a distinction between the American people and the American government. And the president of Vietnam said, we always knew that the American people were our friends. And it was a very moving interchange. The Vietnamese knew that hundreds of thousands of people were in the streets opposing the war. They knew that U.S. GIs were opposing the war and refusing to fight. And this is really something, because if our country had been invaded and poisoned, and this has not happened to us, but if it had, I just can't imagine that we would feel kindly toward anyone in that country that had carried that out.
I can only imagine our reaction to something like that. It's truly incredible.
And I think that's what you see in Japan, is that they don't have this idea of that, you know, this revenge mentality about it. I mean, I think that if we could have a better understanding and a better mindset when it comes to things here in the United States, at least those in our government who are making these decisions are just too obsessed with revenge, which never gets anywhere. And you'd think that with all the history, but as we said, we're sanitizing history, so of course people aren't understanding that lesson. I wanted to talk a little bit about last year. Pentagon Papers whistleblower Daniel Ellsberg talked about how close the U.S. came to using nuclear weapons in the Vietnam War. Can you talk a little bit about, you've written an article about it, how much was that a real possibility? How close were we?
Well, according to Dan Ellsberg, and he actually made this statement at a reunion of the Stanford University anti-war movement, and I was actually moderating that program where he made this statement. But he was in the Pentagon, very high up. He had the ear of the vice president and many people in the government, and he said that we came this close to using nuclear weapons, which would have been, and I just can't even, there are no words to describe the unmitigated disaster that would have caused.
Oh, yeah.
Do you think that the anti-war movement played a role in keeping nuclear weapons off the table, because so many people had stood up and during that war? Do you think that played a part in holding it back from going over the line?
I think it very definitely did. I mean, the people in the U.S. government were very aware and very threatened by the anti-war movement. It was pervasive. There were people in the streets all the time. It just pervaded U.S. society, and I think that they were very concerned about what would happen and the reaction that people would have if they did use nuclear weapons. And that is, of course, if if people survived ultimately.
Right.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting because growing up, I'm 35 years old now, and growing up, you always, you know, my generation at least, probably the generations below me, and even my parents' generation, always looked back at Vietnam as a tragedy generally, and a loss, you could say, for the U.S. Yet today, we still find ourselves, I mean, almost from Vietnam to today, we've been at war or in conflict in one way or another constantly. Why do you feel that is? Why do you feel we have not learned from what I think everybody can universally consider a mistake and a failure in Vietnam and bad policy? Why haven't we learned from that, in your opinion?
That's an interesting question, Tyrell. There was a concept called the Vietnam Syndrome, which for many years prevented the U.S. government from invading other countries because they were afraid of the anti-war movement, basically, that they had seen during the Vietnam War. The other thing they did was to do away with the draft, which also bolstered the anti-war movement during Vietnam, because when young American boys were drafted, that really swelled the ranks of the anti-war movement. Now we have what is called a poverty draft, where poor people, people of color who don't have many opportunities, will go into the military after having been lied to by the recruiters. But it's not the same kind of system of conscription that we used to have. George H.W. Bush, after the first Gulf War, said we finally defeated or licked the Vietnam Syndrome once and for all. And in fact, what has happened since then really ignores what happened during the Vietnam War, and that includes George W. Bush's invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, and Barack Obama's 7 wars, 7 different countries where he's using drones, including his escalation of the wars in Iraq and Syria. And so it seems that we really have no longer remember the lessons of Vietnam. And if there really was a strong anti-war movement, I think we would see many, many fewer people being killed in other countries by U.S. weaponry.
Yeah, how much of a role, we talked a little bit about how the Pentagon revises the reality of these conflicts and wars through this ridiculous $30 million website, which I find mind-blowing. When they could spend $30 million taking care of veterans who've actually served, it's just strange to me. But how much of a role does the media play in revising the reality of these conflicts? Because when you look at it, you have, you know, in El Salvador and Nicaragua, we essentially failed in our objectives to oust parties we disagreed with. In Iraq, we have ISIS, not democracy, as per George W. Bush, who said, you know, we're going to bring them democracy. And Afghanistan is one of the most unstable states on the planet. So what does the U.S. media, or media in general, what part do they play in helping rewrite that history?
Well, during the Vietnam War, the U.S. government realized that when Americans saw pictures of the results of our bombing, there's that iconic photograph of the naked 9-year-old girl running from a U.S. bomber covered with napalm, and that really did a lot toward turning me against the war. It was a visceral reaction. When they saw the body bags of U.S. soldiers coming back, that really, really stoked the anti-war movement. And so they've been very, very careful, the U.S. government, to sanitize what's happening in other countries. They lie about how many civilians are killed with drones. We don't see the images of the children blown up by drones. We don't see their body limbs spread around. We see the Western journalists beheaded by ISIS, and that's horrible. But we don't hear the stories of the drone victims or the survivors of the victims of drones. And Barack Obama has killed more people with drones, many more, than died on 9/11, and continues to kill people with drones, many times getting the wrong people, many times not even knowing who they're killing, because they do what are called, they do kind of these crowd killings, signature strikes, where they're not targeting specific individuals, but they're targeting areas of suspicious activity. And so all males in that area between 16 and 65 are fair game for execution, basically, for assassination. No due process at all, and no arrest. And even though Obama says his preference is to capture, he's only added one person to the ranks of Guantanamo. He's carried out this policy of assassination through drones and other methods. And yet we don't hear about it. Once in a while, we'll see an article in the newspaper saying there was a drone bombing that killed 3 militants. Militants. What's a militant? I mean, we're all militant about things. And so we're really shielded from the information, and the media has really gone along with it. And we know, for example, Judith Miller at the New York Times helped fan the flames of these mythical weapons of mass destruction, you know, which eventually paved the way for Bush's illegal, immoral, unjustified, ineffective war against Iraq, which has resulted in the growth of ISIS, which never existed before he totally destabilized that country.
Well,
thank you so much. Well, one last thing is what can people do? What's the most important thing for people to do to get more educated, and what can they do directly to sort of push forward this bill or get people talking about this more?
Yes, that's a good question. Well, first of all, please contact your congresspersons and tell them to co-sponsor H.R. 2114 to provide compensation for Vietnamese and U.S. People who were victims of Agent Orange. So that's H.R. 2114. In addition, Congress, even though it's dysfunctional, congresspersons do respond to pressure by their constituents, and so does the White House. And so it's really important to speak out, write letters, send emails, call your congressperson, the White House, and tell them how you feel about these drones that are making us no safer while they're blowing people up and killing civilians. Demonstrating, getting together and in First Amendment protected activities. Writing letters to the editor, writing op-eds. Letters to the editor are not hard to get published. Keep them under 150 words and make sure that you reference either a news article or an editorial. And if your letter doesn't get published, other letters from the same point of view will, because they count them up. And so I think that it's important, and the duty of a citizen in a democratic system is to hold the government accountable, is to make sure the government is representing us and not doing things in our name that are really hurting other people and also causing blowback and hurting us as well.
Man, that's some powerful words and some very good information. Once again, that's Marjorie Cohn. I want to thank you for coming on. You're the president of the National Lawyers Guild. You're a professor at Thomas Jefferson School of Law. And it sounds like you've been at the front lines pushing for peace since the 60s on. And thank you very much for your hard work, and keep your voice out there, and keep watching the Hawks, Marjorie.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you. And that is our show for you today. Remember, everyone in this world, we are not told we are loved enough, so I tell you all, I love you. I am Tyrell Ventura.
And I am Tabitha Wallace.
Keep on watching the Hawks, and have a great night, everybody.